He said it without flinching. That was the part that broke her. Not the words themselves, though those were brutal enough. It was the ease of them. The way Vincent Callahan leaned back in his leather chair, voice low and certain, and told his most trusted man, "If she ever fails me, I'll replace her." No hesitation, no flicker of doubt, just a fact, delivered the way you'd discuss replacing a faulty lock on a door. Charlotte stood frozen in the hallway outside his study, rainwater still dripping from her coat onto the marble floor, her hand pressed flat against the wall to keep herself upright. She had come home early. She had been excited. A small, stupid thing. A good day at the foundation. A dinner reservation she wanted to surprise him with. She had been smiling when she reached that hallway. She was not smiling now. If you have ever loved someone completely, given them the quiet, unguarded version of yourself that you've never shown another living soul, and then heard proof that it was always conditional, that somewhere in the fine print of their heart there was an exit clause written in permanent ink, then you already know exactly what Charlotte felt standing in that corridor. And if you haven't, stay with this story. Because what happens next will change how you see love, silence, and the terrible price of words never spoken. Hit the like button if you're already feeling this. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay until the end. I promise you, this one doesn't go where you think it does. Charlotte Whitmore had not planned to fall in love with a man like Vincent Callahan. She had planned, very sensibly, to do her job. She'd been hired 3 years ago to manage the philanthropic arm of the Callahan Family Foundation, a position that required discretion, intelligence, and a particular talent for making powerful men look generous. She was good at it. She was good at most things she put her mind to, which was the reason she'd been recruited in the first place, and she'd walked into that first meeting with Vincent expecting to find exactly what the rumors described. A cold, calculating man who wrote checks as a form of reputation laundering and expected to be thanked for it. What she found was a man who had read every file in her portfolio before she arrived, who asked specific questions, not about her credentials but about her decisions. Why had she redirected funding away from the Downtown Arts Center? What had made her choose the literacy initiative over the veterans' housing proposal? He'd leaned forward with his elbows on the desk and listened to her answers without interrupting, which almost no one ever did. And by the end of the first hour, Charlotte had understood two things simultaneously. This man was far more dangerous than the rumors suggested, and she was already in trouble. She'd kept it professional for 4 months. She was proud of that. Then one Tuesday evening, working late in the foundation's uptown office, she'd found a container of her favorite pastries on her desk with no note. Just the pastries wrapped in the paper from the bakery 3 blocks from his estate, a place she'd mentioned exactly once in passing, 6 weeks earlier. She'd stood there looking at them for a long time before she ate one. It tasted like a question she didn't know how to answer. When she asked him about it the next morning, he hadn't smiled or made it into a moment. He'd just said, "You work through dinner on Tuesdays, that's not sustainable," and turned back to the quarterly report on his desk. As if feeding her was simply a logistical problem he'd identified and solved. That was how it started. Not with candlelight or grand gestures, but with a man who paid attention in ways she'd never experienced. Quietly, practically, without making a performance of it. He remembered that she took her coffee with a single sugar and would rather walk 12 blocks in good shoes than take a car through midtown traffic. He remembered that she disliked being touched unexpectedly, and so he never was unexpected about it. He always telegraphed it, a slight shift of his hand before it reached her shoulder, giving her the half-second to decide whether she wanted it or not. She almost always wanted it. By the time she understood that she was in love with him, she was already living in his estate. By the time she understood that he was in love with her, she had already stopped being afraid of what that meant. Vincent Callahan loved her the way he did everything, with complete attention and zero ornamentation. He didn't say it often, but when he did, it landed. He left the porch light on when she worked late. He kept her particular brand of tea in the kitchen, even though he thought tea was, in his words, a polite substitute for not actually drinking anything. He kissed her forehead in the morning before he went downstairs, and sometimes she would lie there afterward in the warm dark and think, "I didn't know it was supposed to feel like this." She had been a careful woman her whole life, measured, self-contained. She'd grown up watching her mother love men who didn't deserve it and had made a private, ironclad decision not to repeat that pattern. She'd built walls with excellent architecture. And then Vincent Callahan had come along and not broken them down. He'd simply waited outside them, patient and steady, until she'd opened the door herself. That was the thing about trust, she would later think. The more completely you give it, the more completely it can destroy you. The evening it happened had been ordinary in every way that mattered. It was the third week of November, a Tuesday, and the city had been under a slow, humorless rain since morning. Charlotte had spent the day at the foundation offices reviewing grant applications for the spring cycle. Real work, the kind she actually loved, surrounded by folders and her own handwritten notes and 3 empty coffee cups she kept meaning to throw away. She'd lost track of time. That was how she knew it had been a good day, when she looked up and the windows were dark and she hadn't noticed. She caught a cab back to the estate a little after 7, already composing the dinner reservation request in her head. There was a small French place in the West Village she'd been meaning to try. She'd read about it twice and mentioned it once, and Vincent had said, "Make the reservation, I'll be there," because that was how he responded to things she wanted, with simple, direct confirmation, no fanfare. She'd been too busy to book it. Tonight felt right. She paid the cab, walked up the front path in the rain without an umbrella because she hadn't thought to bring one, and let herself in through the side entrance that opened closest to the kitchen, shaking water from her coat. The house was quieter than usual. Margaret, who kept the household running with the efficiency of a military operation, had already gone for the evening. The kitchen light was on, but the main rooms were dim. Charlotte was heading toward the stairs when she heard voices from Vincent's study. The door was not fully closed. It never was, when Lucas was there. Vincent had a particular dislike of conducting business in rooms that felt sealed off, something she'd noticed early on and filed away as one of the small, telling details about him. Lucas Hale had been Vincent's consigliere for 11 years. He was a lean, quiet man with careful eyes, and the kind of stillness that made other people nervous. Charlotte had always found him polite. She'd never been entirely sure he found her anything. She slowed without consciously deciding to. There was something in the register of their voices, low, certain, the specific cadence of men talking about something that mattered, that made her feet go quiet on the marble. She heard Vincent say, "She's been inconsistent. The numbers from the last 2 quarters don't support what she's been telling us." Lucas, "You want to give her more time?" A pause. Then Vincent, in that voice he used when a decision had already been made and the conversation was merely the formality of stating it, "If she ever fails me, I'll replace her." That was all. Charlotte stood in the hallway with her wet coat dripping on the marble and the dinner reservation half formed in her mind and her whole chest hollowed out in an instant, clean as a knife. If she ever fails me, I'll replace her. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She stood there for what was probably 10 seconds but felt like the length of a much longer life. And then she turned and walked quietly toward the stairs, and she did not let herself think anything at all until she reached the bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed in her wet coat. The room was warm. There were fresh flowers on the dresser. He always had someone bring fresh flowers on Tuesdays, because she'd once said offhandedly that the start of the week felt long. The porch light was on downstairs, the way it always was when she came home late. His jacket was folded over the back of the chair in the corner, the particular careless way he left it, and his reading glasses were on the nightstand, and the whole room was full of him in the quiet, accumulated way that 3 years of shared life fills a space. And she sat in the middle of all of it and thought, of course, not outrage, not hot fury, something much colder and much more precise. Of course there were conditions. There are always conditions. She'd known this about powerful men. She'd grown up knowing it. She had watched her mother discover it, again and again, with different men who all had the same fine print. And she had told herself, she had believed, that Vincent was different. Not because he was perfect. She'd never needed him to be perfect. But because in 3 years she had never once felt like a contingency. She felt like one now. The worst part, the part that made it so precisely devastating, was that she couldn't even call it a betrayal. He hadn't lied to her. He'd just told his consigliere the truth in a room with a slightly open door, and she had heard it. And now she knew. The terms of this love, the architecture of it, how much space she occupied in his life and exactly how long she'd occupy it. As long as she didn't fail him. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at them. She thought about the pastries on the desk 4 months in. how she'd stood there reading significance into a bag of croissants like an idiot. She thought about the porch light. She thought about the way he said her name sometimes, quiet and without decoration, like it was simply the correct word for something he was thinking about. She thought about every small, careful gesture she'd catalogued and held up as evidence that this was real, that she was safe here. Had she been wrong about all of it? She didn't know. That was the unbearable part. She genuinely didn't know, and she couldn't ask him. How do you ask a man whether you're disposable without confirming that you already suspected it? And so she was left sitting on the edge of their bed in a wet coat with 3 years of carefully assembled faith coming apart at the seams, and no clean way to tell whether it had ever been real or whether she'd simply been very, very good at wanting it to be. Downstairs, she heard the study door open, heard Lucas's voice, a brief closing exchange, then the front door, then silence. Then Vincent's footsteps on the stairs. She had about 30 seconds to decide what face to put on. She stood up, took off her coat, hung it on the back of the door, sat down again. He knocked twice, and he always knocked, even in their own room, another one of those details she'd loved, and opened the door and saw her. "You're back," he said. Something shifted in his expression when he looked at her, though she couldn't have named what. "You're soaking." "I forgot an umbrella." He crossed the room, picked up her coat from the door, and carried it toward the bathroom to hang it properly. As if the coat was the problem. As if the problem was the coat. "I thought we could get dinner," Charlotte said. "That place in the West Village." He came back out. "Now?" "If you're not too tired." He looked at her for a moment. Vincent Callahan had very dark eyes, and he used them with the same economy he used everything. Precise, deliberate, without waste. She had always found it impossible to lie to those eyes, which was one of the reasons she'd stopped trying about 2 years ago. She was lying to them now, or at least she was withholding, which was close enough. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. She nodded. He went to change. She sat on the bed and listened to the sounds of him moving in the dressing room and made a private interior decision that she would not think about this tonight. She would have dinner. She would be normal. And then she would figure out what the rest of her life looked like. That was the first lie she told herself. There would be many more before it was over. The dinner was fine. That was the word she kept coming back to, riding home in the back of the car with the rain still coming down, and Vincent's hand resting near hers on the seat without quite touching. Fine. The food was what the reviews had promised. The wine was good. Vincent had ordered for himself without consulting the menu at length, the way he always did, and had asked her 2 questions about her day and listened to the answers with his full attention, the way he always did. And at one point, he'd reached across the table and adjusted the angle of her water glass because the condensation was threatening to drip onto her sleeve, and she had thought, he notices everything about me, and none of it matters if I'm still replaceable. She smiled at the right moments. She laughed once. A real laugh, she was pretty sure. Some small involuntary thing that came out before she could stop it, because he'd said something dry and quietly funny, and her body had responded before her mind could intervene. She hated that she could still laugh. It would have been simpler if she couldn't. In the car home, he was quiet, looking at the rain on the window, and she looked at the side of his face and tried to see him clearly. This man she'd chosen. This man who kept the porch light on and remembered croissants and said, "I'll be there," when she made a reservation, who kissed her forehead before he went downstairs, and who held the weight of an empire in his hands, and somehow, inexplicably, still had enough attention left to notice when the condensation on her water glass was about to become a problem. If she ever fails me, I'll replace her. She turned back to the window. When they got home, the porch light was on. She looked at it as she walked up the front path. That particular light, the one he'd asked to have installed 6 months into their relationship, quietly, without explaining why. And she'd understood anyway. And she felt the grief of it land fully for the first time. She had thought that light meant, "You are always welcome here." She understood now that it might only mean, "You are welcome here for as long as you don't disappoint me." Those were very different things. She walked past it and went inside. And behind her, Vincent held the door, and the light stayed on long after they'd both gone to bed, illuminating the empty path, keeping faith with a version of the night that no longer quite existed. Charlotte woke at 4:17 in the morning and lay absolutely still. This was not unusual. She had always been a light sleeper, always surfaced from sleep at odd hours, and lay cataloging the sounds of whatever space she occupied, a habit from childhood, from the years of listening for footsteps in hallways, for voices pitched low enough to mean trouble. Old instincts. She'd thought she'd outgrown them. She hadn't. Vincent was asleep beside her. She could hear the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. He slept the way he did everything else, completely, without apparent conflict. And she lay next to him in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the previous evening's revelation sitting on her chest like something with weight. Physical. Unmovable. If she ever fails me, I'll replace her. She'd managed to get through dinner. She'd managed to get through the car ride home, the coming inside, the ordinary rituals of getting ready for bed. She'd even managed to fall asleep eventually, which surprised her. Her body, apparently, had not received the message that everything was different now. She turned her head and looked at him. In sleep, Vincent Callahan lost approximately nothing of himself. Some people looked diminished in sleep, softer, less, like the version of them that existed in the world required a kind of maintenance they couldn't sustain unconscious. Not Vincent. He lay with one arm bent beneath the pillow and his face turned slightly away from her, and he looked exactly like who he was, a man with the full weight of his own nature settled into him, not performing anything. She had loved that about him, the absence of performance. She looked at the line of his jaw, the gray at his temple that had appeared in the last year, that he hadn't commented on, and neither had she. Though she'd noticed it the first morning she saw it and felt something she couldn't name then and still couldn't now. Tenderness, maybe, or fear, or the particular ache that comes from watching someone you love show proof of time passing, replace her. She turned back to the ceiling. She needed to think about this clearly. She was a precise woman. She'd built her career on the ability to strip emotion from a problem and look at the actual structure of it. She could do that now. She could be logical. The logical facts were these. She had heard one sentence. She did not know the context. She did not know who they were discussing. She had not stayed long enough to hear anything else, because her legs had stopped working and her brain had done that thing it sometimes did under extreme stress, where it locked down all non-essential functions and focused entirely on survival, which in this case meant moving away from the sound before it could say anything worse. So, she was operating on incomplete information. Also logical, Vincent had given her 3 years of consistent, specific behavior that pointed in a direction exactly opposite to disposability. The croissants, the porch light, the water glass, the way he always knocked before entering a room she was in. The particular quality of his attention, which was not the attention of a man maintaining an asset, she knew that kind. She had watched her mother receive that attention and had learned to identify it young. So, the evidence was contradictory. The problem, and here was where logic stopped being clean, was that none of the contradictory evidence changed what she'd heard. Because he'd said it. Those specific words, in that specific order, in his own voice, with that specific certainty. And she could construct all the alternative context she wanted, but she couldn't unhear it, and she couldn't ask him, and so she was left with a wound and no clean way to dress it. She was still staring at the ceiling at 5:40 when his alarm went off. Vincent silenced it with one practiced motion and lay still for a moment, the way he always did. Gathering himself, she'd always thought, running through the day's architecture before he committed to consciousness. Then he turned onto his back, and she felt him look at her. "You're awake," he said. "I woke up a while ago." "Couldn't sleep?" "Just one of those nights." He looked at her a moment longer. She kept her eyes on the ceiling, which was not unusual enough to be a tell. She often lay like this in the mornings, thinking about the day. He accepted it. He always accepted her rhythms without requiring explanation, which had been one of the things she loved most about him, and now struck her as potentially just an efficient way to manage a person without requiring intimacy. She hated the thought the moment she had it. She hated even more that she couldn't make it go away. Vincent got up. He went through the morning routine. Shower, the deliberate sounds of a man moving through a space he knew completely by feel, and came back dressed and crossed to her side of the bed and did what he always did. Put his hand briefly at her temple, fingers barely touching her hair, and pressed his mouth to her forehead. She closed her eyes. The kiss lasted 3 seconds. His hand was warm. He smelled like the soap he'd used for as long as she'd known him. Something plain, unscented, which she'd teased him about once, very early, saying that for a man with his resources, he could afford to smell like something other than function, and he'd looked at her with that flat, almost amused expression and said, "I smell like someone who showers. That's enough." He pulled back. "I'll be home by 7, he said. "Okay." He looked at her once more, that deliberate look, and then he left. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, steady and unhurried, and then the particular sound of the front door, and then nothing. She lay in the room alone and breathed in the smell of his soap still hanging in the air, and thought, how many more mornings do I have left here? It was the first time she'd framed it that way. It wouldn't be the last. Well, she got through the next 3 days by being very busy. This was not difficult. The spring grant cycle created genuine work, applications to evaluate, site visits to schedule, 3 conference calls with partner organizations, and a board presentation she'd been preparing for 6 weeks that needed its final revisions. She had enough to fill every hour. She filled them. She arrived at the office before anyone else and left after everyone but the security desk. She ate lunch at her desk. She took notes by hand instead of on her laptop, because the physical act of writing kept her mind from wandering somewhere she didn't want it to go, at least for a few minutes at a time. The first evening, Vincent texted at 6:15, "Running late, don't wait on dinner." She replied, "No problem," put her phone face down, went back to the grant report. The second evening, he was home at the time he'd said, and she was in the sitting room with her laptop, and he came in, loosened his tie, sat down across from her and said, "Tell me about your day." It was such an ordinary request, such a specifically him request, not "how was your day," which was a formality, but "tell me about it," which was an instruction to actually talk to him. She had always found it quietly charming, the directness of it. She found it unbearable now. She told him about the grant applications. She kept it factual, low temperature, the kind of report she'd give to a board member. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered them. They had dinner. Margaret had left something in the oven, and she kept her attention on her plate and the conversation that existed at the level of the surface. And when he looked at her with that particular focused look of his, she looked away, toward the window, toward her glass, anywhere but at the precise, searching quality of his eyes. She slept poorly again, both nights. The third day, her assistant Nora stopped in the doorway of her office at 3:30 and said, "Are you okay?" Charlotte looked up. "I'm fine." Nora was 26 and possessed the particular fearlessness of someone who hadn't yet been properly humiliated by the world. She did not move from the doorway. "You've had the same grant file open since 9 o'clock this morning, and I don't think you've scrolled down once." Charlotte looked at the screen. Nora was right. "I'm working through something," Charlotte said. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." Then, because that was too sharp. "Thank you. I just need to focus." Nora left. Charlotte looked at the grant file. She thought about Charlotte Whitmore at 26, sharper in some ways, softer in others, with a very clear idea of how she would conduct her life and absolutely no idea what any of it would actually feel like. She closed the file, opened it again, read the same paragraph 4 times. "If she ever fails me." She pressed her fingers against her eyes. The problem was that she couldn't locate the specific failure. She'd been turning it over for 3 days and she couldn't find it. The things she'd done, or not done, that had moved her from certainty into contingency. Had she missed something, been too focused on the foundation, not focused enough on him? She ran through the past month with the precision of someone auditing accounts, looking for the transaction that didn't balance, and found nothing conclusive. Which meant either she hadn't failed yet, and the words were perspective, a policy statement rather than a judgment, or she'd failed in ways she couldn't see, which was somehow worse. She was so tired. Vincent noticed on the 4th day. She knew he would. He was observant in the specific way of someone who had survived long enough to understand that survival depended on reading rooms accurately. He'd had that quality when she met him, the total, unsentimental attention to detail, and it had only sharpened in the years since. He noticed things other people missed. He noticed things she missed, sometimes, about herself. They were in the kitchen on Thursday morning. She'd come down early, couldn't sleep again, and he was standing at the counter with his coffee, and she was at the table with hers, and it should have been easy. They'd had 1,000 Thursday mornings in this kitchen. She knew the exact quality of the light at 7 a.m. when the clouds were low, knew the particular sound the old radiator made in November, knew how he stood at the counter, weight on the left, coffee in the right hand, whatever papers needed his attention in the left. And all of it was so familiar it should have been comfortable, and instead it felt like standing in a room she was about to lose. He put his papers down. "Charlotte." She looked up. He was watching her with that focused expression, the one she'd never successfully lied to. "Something's wrong." It was not a question. "I'm tired," she said. I haven't been sleeping well." "That's not what I'm talking about." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to be honest, not long enough to be accountable, and then she looked at her coffee. "I have a lot going on with the foundation. The board presentation is Monday, and I'm Charlotte." Just her name, the way he said it when he needed her to stop performing. She looked up again. I was still watching her, and there was something in his face that she wasn't equipped to process right now. Concern, maybe. Or the specific tension of a man who knows something is happening and is exercising enormous restraint not to reach in and fix it immediately. That was Vincent. He had an instinct for control that was essentially metabolic, and choosing not to exercise it cost him something, and she could see that it was costing him now. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need to get through this presentation." He held her gaze for a moment longer. She waited for him to push. This was usually where he pushed, where the directness that she'd always found both frightening and deeply comforting would come forward and demand honesty. He picked up his coffee. "Tell me how it goes Monday," he said, and he went back to his papers. She looked at the back of his head and felt the strangest grief, not because he'd pushed, but because he hadn't. Because he'd seen that she needed space and had given it to her without requiring explanation, which was precisely the kind of thing she'd have listed 3 weeks ago as evidence of how well he knew her. Now it just felt like distance, like she was already disappearing and he was letting her go. She got up and rinsed her mug and left the kitchen, and neither of them said anything else about it. By the second week, she had stopped waiting for him at the front door. This was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, and she couldn't stop herself. She'd had a habit, not a plan, just something that had evolved naturally over the course of their first year together, of being somewhere on the ground floor when he came home. Not waiting, exactly. Not positioned at the door with her hands folded like something from another century. Just present, available. In the kitchen or the sitting room, within earshot, so that the first thing he encountered when he came through the door was not an empty house. She stopped. She started going upstairs earlier, taking books to bed, her laptop, work she could ostensibly finish there as well as anywhere. When she heard his key in the lock, she stayed where she was and listened to the sounds of him coming home. The door, his footsteps, the brief pause in the hallway that she now understood was the moment he oriented to the house, checked the quality of the silence, and she stayed very still upstairs and waited for the sounds to reach her. She hated herself a little for it. Vincent came upstairs on the second evening of this new arrangement and stood in the doorway and looked at her with her book, which she hadn't read a page of. "You didn't come down," he said. "I got comfortable." He came in, sat on the edge of the bed. He was still in his suit, hadn't yet changed, which meant he'd come straight up. "You've been going to bed earlier." "I'm trying to fix my sleep." He looked at the book in her hands. She was holding it at an angle that would have made it physically impossible to read in the current light. He looked at the lamp, which she hadn't turned on. She turned it on. "Charlotte," he said, "talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about. You're lying to me." The bluntness of it landed like a flat hand. She felt her chin lift, a reflex defensiveness, the physical posture of a woman who was not going to be maneuvered into a confession she hadn't decided to make. "I'm not lying," she said. "I'm tired. I told you that." "You're not tired. You're somewhere else." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You have been for a week and a half. I want to know where." "Vincent, don't manage me." Quiet. Absolutely quiet, but with a current under it. "Don't give me the voice you use when you're handling a difficult board member. I know the difference." She looked at him. He looked back, and she saw it then. Not anger. Something that might have been fear, if Vincent Callahan was capable of fear in the ordinary sense, which she'd always suspected he was, but had only seen evidence of twice in 3 years, both times involving her. His hands were clasped between his knees and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing that thing where they went very still, like he was forcing them to stay neutral. She could have told him. That was the thing she would think about later, in the long months of what came after. She could have told him right there, in the lamp-lit room with the rain starting up again outside, and his hands clasped hard enough that the knuckles were pale. She could have said, "I heard you, Vincent. I heard what you said to Lucas. I need to know if it was about me." She could have given him the chance to answer. She didn't, because here was the other possibility, the one she hadn't let herself look at directly, the one that existed in the periphery of all her sleepless hours. What if she asked and the answer confirmed it? What if she asked and he said, "Yes, of course it was about you. That's the agreement. That's always been the agreement. What did you think this was?" What if she had been right, and asking the question meant she could no longer pretend there was another explanation? The not knowing was terrible, but it was survivable. She was surviving it. The knowing might not be. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need some time." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move through him, the effort, she understood, of not pushing. He stood up, crossed to the dresser, began removing his watch, his cufflinks, the small rituals of a man unwinding a day. "Okay," he said, quietly. Just that. She picked up her and stared at the page and didn't read a single word. She missed the charity gala. This was not a small thing, and she knew it when she did it. The Callahan Foundation's annual winter fundraiser was one of the two most visible events on the philanthropic calendar. Not just her professional responsibility, but the event she'd redesigned from the ground up in her first year, which had been a disaster of overlapping speech-making and cold salmon before she arrived and had since become something people actually wanted to attend. She'd been planning this year's iteration for 4 months. She called in sick. 24 hours before, citing a migraine, speaking to the Foundation's events coordinator rather than to Vincent directly, because if she heard his voice, she was going to either cry or confess or both, and she was not prepared to do either. She spent the evening in the sitting room of her old apartment. She'd kept it, technically, though she'd been at the estate full-time for over 2 years and used it only as a workspace occasionally. Eating takeout she didn't taste, and sitting in the particular silence of a space that was hers alone. No history here, no shared rituals, no porch light, just her own walls and her own quiet. She'd forgotten how strange it was, being the only person in a space. She'd forgotten how it felt before him. Her phone lit up at 7:45, Vincent. She looked at it for 4 rings and let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. He texted 10 minutes later. "Are you all right?" She wrote back, "Migraine resting, don't worry." He sent, "Do you need anything?" She looked at the question. She put the phone face down on the cushion beside her. She did not go back to the estate that night. She told herself it was because the migraine, the fictional migraine, made driving unwise and that she'd be better off here. She put herself to bed on the narrow mattress in the second bedroom and lay in the dark and thought about the gala happening across the city without her, and Vincent moving through it alone, and what story he was telling people about where she was. She thought about what story she was telling herself about why she was here. The ceiling of her old apartment was lower than the one at the estate. The radiator clicked and knocked. She lay there and listened to it and tried to remember if she'd been happy in this apartment before Vincent, and couldn't decide if the happiness she remembered had been real or just the retrospective comfort of places where nothing has yet gone wrong. At 2 in the morning, her phone lit up again. She didn't look. In the morning, there were 3 texts, 2 from Vincent, the last one sent at 11:14 p.m., reading simply, "I'll leave the light on," and one from Lucas Hale, which she'd never received before, which read, "Charlotte, he's worried. If you're well enough, please reach out to him." She stared at that one for a long time. Lucas Hale, who had been in the study, who had heard Vincent say the words, who was now texting her on Vincent's behalf, without knowing what she knew, without any awareness that the concern he was relaying was precisely the thing that had driven her to this narrow bed in this silent apartment. She didn't reply to any of them. She got up, made coffee in a machine that ground beans poorly, and produced something that tasted like ambition without follow-through. Stood at the window, looking at the street below, the early November morning coming in gray and cold, people already moving through it with their coats pulled close. She thought, "I have to go back." She thought, "Can't go back." She thought, "This is what it looks like when a life starts to close." She went back that afternoon. Not because she'd resolved anything, she hadn't, but because avoiding the estate was starting to feel like a decision she hadn't consciously made. and she'd always believed that the worst choices were the ones you made by not making them. She packed her overnight bag, locked the apartment, called a car. Vincent was not home when she arrived. The house was in Margaret's capable hands, and Margaret greeted her with the specific neutrality of a woman who had been in service long enough to have seen many things and learned to look directly through all of them. She asked if Charlotte wanted anything. Charlotte said no. She went upstairs. She stood in the middle of the bedroom. His reading glasses were on the nightstand. His jacket was over the chair. The flowers on the dresser were fresh, newer than the ones that had been there before her night away, which meant someone had replaced them while she was gone. A Tuesday morning delivery, even though she hadn't been here. He'd kept the routine even when she was absent. She sat on the bed and looked at the flowers. White roses this week. She didn't have a preference for any particular flower, had never told him one, and so he rotated through whatever was seasonal and available, which she had always considered more thoughtful than if he'd simply chosen a favorite and stuck with it, because it meant he was thinking about it each time, freshly, rather than following a set instruction. She reached out and touched one of the petals. If she ever fails me. She pulled her hand back. When Vincent came home at 6:30 and found her in the sitting room with her laptop, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with a relief so controlled it was almost invisible, and said, "You're here." "I'm here," she said. He crossed the room and sat across from her and didn't say anything else immediately, and she kept her eyes on her screen. And the silence between them was a third person in the room, solid and badly dressed, waiting to see who was going to acknowledge it first. Neither of them did. He asked about her head. She said it was better. He said good. She asked about the gala. He said it went fine, which was Vincent's way of saying it went adequately in her absence, and he had no intention of saying so more specifically than that. She said that was good. He said Maria Chen had asked after her. The conversation continued at that altitude, manageable, correct, covering the necessary distance without touching anything real. And through dinner and after, until they went to bed and lay in the dark on opposite sides of a mattress that had once felt inadequate for how much of each other they'd occupied, and now felt almost generously large. She stared at the ceiling. He was awake. She knew the specific quality of his waking silence versus his sleeping silence. She'd had 3 years to learn the difference. And he was awake, lying in the dark with whatever was happening in his head, not reaching for her, not demanding, just present and waiting, and probably more frightened than he'd ever let her see. She thought, I should tell him. She thought, I can't tell him. She thought, if I tell him and it was about me, I lose everything in this room. She thought, if I don't tell him, I lose it anyway, just more slowly. She closed her eyes. She was 12 days out from the hallway, and she was no closer to knowing whether she was dismantling the most real thing that had ever happened to her or finally seeing it clearly. And the difference between those two possibilities was the entire rest of her life arranged on one side of a scale or the other, with no way to weigh it. She slept eventually, badly. An hour before dawn, she surfaced from a dream she couldn't remember but whose emotion clung to her. Loss, she thought, or the anticipation of it, which was in some ways worse, and lay in the gray pre-morning light and made the first decision she'd made clearly in almost 2 weeks. She was going to leave. Not today. Not this week, maybe. But the architecture of her exit had begun forming in the back of her mind the way things do when you've been thinking around something for long enough. The specific clarity of a conclusion that has already been reached, just not yet admitted to. She could not stay in this house not knowing. She could not keep performing ordinary life in the shadow of those words. She could not stand next to the porch light every evening and wonder whether she was still earning it or just running down the clock on its mercy. She was going to leave before she became the kind of woman who stayed out of fear of losing. She had watched that woman before. She knew how it ended. She lay very still in the early morning beside the sleeping man she loved and began, in the private architecture of her own mind, to plan the shape of her disappearance. She gave herself 1 week. That was the agreement she made with herself in the gray pre-dawn of that November morning, lying beside a man she still loved with a completeness that felt, under the circumstances, like a personal failing. 1 week to arrange the practical architecture of leaving. 1 week to do it quietly, without spectacle, without giving him the opportunity to talk her out of something she hadn't fully talked herself into yet. She was methodical about it. This was perhaps the most Charlotte Whitmore thing about the entire situation. That even in the middle of the worst heartbreak of her adult life, she made lists, mental ones, organized by category. Financial. She had her own accounts, had always kept them, not out of distrust, but out of the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who'd learned young that dependency was a form of exposure. She had enough. She could land. Professional, she would need to address the foundation, which was the complicated part. She'd built that organization into something that mattered, and walking away from it felt like a different kind of loss, adjacent to the main one, but with its own specific grief. Personal, the apartment, which she'd kept and now understood she'd kept for a reason, some subterranean instinct she hadn't let herself acknowledge. The ring. She thought about the ring. Vincent had given it to her 14 months ago, on a Tuesday. She'd noticed the day and teased him about it, said he had a Tuesday fixation, and he'd looked at her with that almost amused expression and said, "Tuesdays are when you're most yourself. You've stopped trying to be impressive by Tuesday." It was, she had thought then, the most Vincent thing anyone had ever said to her. She'd worn it every day since. She looked at it now, in the early morning light. The modest band she'd chosen herself from 3 options. He'd presented without comment, no pressure, just 3 boxes open on the table and his eyes on her face while she decided. She would leave it behind. Whatever else she took or didn't take, the ring stayed. It wasn't hers to keep if the context that had made it meaningful no longer existed. She got through the week by moving very carefully, the way you move through a room in the dark, hands out, measuring distance, not rushing, trusting that if you're deliberate enough you won't break anything before you're ready. She went to the foundation. She completed the board presentation, which went well. She was professional to the last, always. It was one of her less charming qualities, and shook hands and accepted compliments and then went back to her office and sat very still for 7 minutes before she could start dismantling what needed to be dismantled. She spoke to the foundation's deputy director, a steady and capable woman named Priya, who had been with the organization for 4 years and was, Charlotte had always known, more than ready to step into an expanded role. She framed it as a conversation about leadership development. She asked Priya to take point on the spring grant cycle. Priya said yes, efficiently, without excessive surprise, which told Charlotte that the transition had probably been more visible to the people around her than she'd realized. She called her lawyer on a Wednesday afternoon from a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, not from the estate, not from anywhere Vincent's people might incidentally overhear. Standard consultation, she told herself. Just making sure she understood her position, just being practical. She was a practical woman. At home, she was careful to keep the temperature exactly steady. This was harder than the professional dismantling because it required performing a version of herself that she was in the process of evacuating. She came downstairs in the mornings. She drank her coffee at the kitchen table. She asked about his meetings and answered questions about hers, and twice she made herself sit close enough on the sitting room couch that their shoulders touched, because she understood that if she let the physical distance widen too fast, he would notice and push, and she was not ready for the push yet. She needed 3 more days. She counted them. The suitcase was the decision point. She'd thought about this. The symbolism of it, taking 1 bag, leaving the rest, was intentional, not dramatic. She was not trying to make a statement. She was trying to make a distinction between the life she'd built here, which she was relinquishing, and the self she'd had before it, which she was reclaiming. 1 bag was what she'd arrived with, more or less. 1 bag was the amount of herself she could carry forward. She waited until a Thursday. Vincent had a late meeting. She knew his schedule the way she knew his breathing, involuntarily, completely. A meeting that would keep him across the city until 9 or 10, with Lucas and 2 other men whose names she knew but whose faces she'd made a point of not learning. She'd suggested it herself 3 days ago when he mentioned the meeting was being rescheduled. "Thursday works," she'd said. "I have foundation things in the evening anyway." He'd looked at her with the particular focused attention she'd come to dread and then said, "Thursday it is." She'd felt sick doing it. She did it anyway. She packed with the specific efficiency of someone who has thought about this moment more carefully than she'd like to admit. Clothing, practical, seasonally appropriate, enough for 2 weeks without being so much that it announced permanence. Her laptop. The folder of personal documents she kept in the top drawer of her own desk in the small room she used as a study. Passport, financial records, the few photographs she had in print rather than stored on a phone. The book she was currently reading, which she almost left behind on principle and then took anyway because she was leaving enough things. She did not take the cashmere throw he'd bought her because she'd once mentioned being cold in the sitting room. She did not take the silk robe on the back of the bathroom door. She did not take the second phone charger that lived on her nightstand, which he'd bought because she kept forgetting hers at the office. She did not take any of the jewelry he'd given her, which filled approximately 2 drawers and represented a recurring theme of his. That he expressed things in objects when words felt insufficient, which she'd always understood even when she pretended she didn't. She went to his study last. She'd written the letter 4 days ago, on paper, by hand, which felt important. Not a text, not an email, nothing that could be forwarded or screenshotted or minimized to a notification. Paper, which you had to pick up and hold, which transferred something of the person who wrote it. She'd written 4 drafts. The final one was 2 pages, which felt like too much and also like not enough. She put it on his desk, centered. She put the ring on top of it because she couldn't figure out another way to make the letter's meaning immediately and completely clear without requiring him to read it first. She thought about that, the order of understanding, and decided it was kinder this way. Better that he know before he reads so he can prepare whatever he needs to prepare. She stood in his study for a moment. The room smelled like him, leather, and the particular paper smell of old books, the faint trace of the coffee he drank at his desk, the absence of any cologne because Vincent Callahan did not wear cologne. She had always loved this room. She had sat in the chair across from his desk 100 times, doing her own work, comfortable in the shared silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill space with noise. She had sat in that chair the evening it ended, coming in from the rain, coat dripping, heart intact. She picked up her bag and left. The cabin in Connecticut belonged to her college friend Dana, who spent winters in San Francisco and left the key under the 3rd stone to the left of the back steps, an arrangement they'd maintained for years based on mutual trust and the understanding that sometimes people needed somewhere that wasn't their life. Charlotte had called Dana from the coffee shop the same day she'd called her lawyer. Dana had said, without asking for the full story, "The key's where it always is. There's firewood on the porch. I'll tell the caretaker you're coming." Then after a pause, "Are you okay?" And Charlotte had said, "I will be," which was honest without being a lie, which was the best she could manage. The drive from the city was 2 hours and 40 minutes. She drove herself, had arranged the car rental from her phone that morning, had not told anyone where she was going except Dana. She drove through the late afternoon into the early evening, and when the city receded behind her and the roads opened up and the trees came in on both sides, bare now, November stripped, the particular skeletal honesty of late autumn New England, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not better, not resolved, just a small easing of the specific pressure that came from maintaining a performance in close quarters with its audience. She found the key where Dana said it would be. The cabin was cold, had been closed up for a week, and she moved through it turning on heat and lights, a practical circuit of the space, before she sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself to stop moving. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Vincent coming home to the silent house, the letter, the ring. She thought about the exact quality of the silence he would walk into. She knew this house's silences by type could distinguish the empty but expecting silence from the genuinely vacant kind, and what it would tell him before he even reached his study. She thought about his face. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. She had done the right thing. She had made the only choice available to a woman who refused to spend her life waiting to be found insufficient. She had been honest in the letter. Not brutal, but honest, which was harder. And she had left cleanly, without a scene, without putting him in the position of having to say something irreversible. She had been, by every measure she could apply, decent. She still felt like she'd amputated something. She made herself tea in Dana's kitchen, using the box of tea bags in the 3rd cabinet where it had been kept for years, and sat with it at the table and watched the darkness outside the window settle into the particular density of rural November nights. No city glow, no street noise, just the wind in the bare trees and the sounds of the cabin adjusting to warmth. Her phone was on the table in front. It had not rung. She checked the time, 9:47. He'd be home by now. He was always home by 10 on late meeting nights, earlier if the meeting resolved quickly, which this one might have. She'd heard him mention to someone that the agenda was short. She looked at the phone. She turned it face down. She went to bed at 10:30 and lay in the narrow cabin bed in the dark and waited for the phone to ring from the other room. And at midnight it finally did. Once, twice, 3 times. And she lay there and let it, and counted the rings the way you count something you're not sure you can afford. He didn't leave a voicemail. She closed her eyes. She'd been at the cabin 4 days when Lucas Hale knocked on the door. She heard the car first, tires on the gravel access road moving slowly, the specific sound of someone who knows where they're going but is being careful about it. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a second cup of coffee and a grant report she'd promised to consult on for Priya. And when she heard the car, she went still the way animals go still, the deep involuntary stillness of something that doesn't yet know if it needs to run. She went to the window. The car was black. Late model, no plates visible from this angle. One person inside, but she could see that much. And then the door opened and Lucas Hale unfolded himself from the driver's seat, and she felt her stomach drop precisely 2 inches. She stood at the window and watched him walk to the front door and knock 3 times. Deliberate, unhurried, the knock of a man who knows he'll be answered and is prepared to wait. She could not answer it. She understood this even as the not answering had a brief, vivid appeal. He knew she was here. The rental car was in the drive, the lights were on, the smoke from the fireplace she'd lit that morning was still threading upward. She was unambiguously present. She opened the door. Lucas looked at her. His face was doing its default thing, unreadable, the surface perfectly composed. But there was something in his eyes that she'd never seen there in 3 years of polite professional coexistence. Not warmth. Something more complex than warmth. Concern, maybe, but the kind that didn't know what to do with itself. "Charlotte," he said, "how did you find me?" "You rented the car on a card. It wasn't difficult." He paused. "May I come in?" "Did he send you?" A brief hesitation. "No." She looked at him for a moment, reading the specific geography of his stillness, which she'd had 3 years to learn and had always found difficult. Lucas Hale was the least legible person she'd ever been around with regularity, which was presumably one of the reasons he'd survived 11 years as Vincent Callahan's consigliere. She stepped back and let him in. He came inside, looked around the cabin with the brief, cataloging glance of a man assessing spaces automatically, not suspiciously, just habit, the way her father used to check exits when he entered a room, old military reflex. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, because Lucas Hale operated from a baseline of authority that didn't require invitation, and she sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "He doesn't know you're here," Lucas said. "You said." "He's been—" He paused, choosing the word with the care of someone who rarely spoke imprecisely. "Unwell, since Tuesday." "Unwell." "He hasn't taken a meeting since he found your letter. He's canceled 3 things that don't get canceled. He's not—" Another pause. "He's not himself." She looked at her coffee. "Lucas," she said, "I'm not going back because he's having a hard week." "I know that." He said it without impatience, which surprised her. "I'm not here to bring you back." "Then why are you here?" He put both hands flat on the table, an unusual gesture for him, something almost deliberate about the openness of it, palms down like he was establishing ground. He looked at her directly. "Because you heard something," he said. The air in the room changed. She felt it first in her hands, a sudden chill, then heat, the body's response to shock or the anticipation of it. She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still. "Excuse me?" "The night of the rain, 3 weeks ago." His voice was even, factual, the register he used for presenting information that had been verified. "You came home early. You were in the hallway outside the study. You heard part of a conversation." She said nothing. "I know you heard it," he said. "I knew it that night. I saw your coat on the hallway floor when I left. Wet, where you'd been standing. The marble. I knew." He took a breath. "I should have said something then. I didn't. That was a mistake. I'm here because that mistake has cost more than I intended." Charlotte looked at him. Her hands around the mug were very still. "What do you want me to say?" "Nothing yet." He held her gaze. "I want you to hear something first." "I heard enough." "You heard 1 sentence," Lucas said, "out of a conversation that lasted 40 minutes. And the sentence you heard—" He stopped, looked at the table, looked back up. It wasn't about you. The cabin was very quiet. The word landed in that quiet like a stone dropped in still water, and Charlotte sat with the ripples of it spreading outward and felt something complex and violent moving through her chest. Not relief, not yet, because she didn't trust it yet, because she had built 3 weeks of anguish on the architecture of those words, and she was not going to let them be dismantled by 2 seconds of a stranger's calm assertion. "Don't," she said. Her voice was low and had an edge she hadn't fully intended. "Charlotte, don't do that. Don't come here and tell me I misunderstood because he sent you to fix it and you need to find a way. He didn't send me." Still even, still factual. "He doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't know what you heard. He has no idea why you left. He's read your letter 100 times and he still doesn't know what he did." She stared at him. "The conversation you heard," Lucas said, "was about Claire Donovan." She didn't say anything. She was appointed director of the Foundation's governance committee in October. We'd been watching her numbers for 2 quarters. She'd been inconsistent, moving money between line items without full board transparency, nothing criminal, but not the standard we hold our people to. We were deciding whether to give her another quarter or move her out. That was what you walked in on. He paused. Vincent said what he said about Claire Donovan, a person who has been in the organization for 4 months and whom he has never, to my knowledge, mentioned in your presence. The room was absolutely still. Charlotte looked at Lucas Hale's face and looked for the thing that would tell her he was managing her, the fractional oversell, the careful placement of detail that signaled construction rather than recollection. She'd been trained to look for it. She'd been looking for it her whole adult life. She couldn't find it. "Say it again," she said. "The conversation was about Claire Donovan, not you. It has never been about you." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "In 11 years, I have never heard Vincent Callahan speak about you in those terms. Not once, not privately, not in anger, not hypothetically." Another pause, and she understood this one cost him something. Lucas Hale did not make personal statements freely. "You are the only person I have watched him be afraid of losing." Charlotte put her mug down. She put it down because her hands had started to shake. A fine, involuntary tremor. Not dramatic, not collapsing level, just the physical evidence of something enormous moving through her, and she did not want to hold something breakable right now. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Same gesture Lucas had made, she noticed distantly. Palms down. 3 weeks, she said. "Yes. I have been—" She stopped, started again. "Left him because of something he said about a person I've never met." Lucas said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She stood up. She didn't know she was going to until she was already standing, pushing back from the table, crossing to the window. The lake was visible from here. Dana's cabin sat at a slight elevation, and through the bare trees you could see the gray water in the afternoon light. She stared at it and tried to locate herself in the specific geography of what she'd just been told. Not about her. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleepless mornings and tactical coffee cups and the slow, deliberate dismantling of the most real thing in her life. The suitcase. The letter. The ring she'd set on top of it as a kind of punctuation mark, as if to say, "I understand the terms, here is my response." The drive up here through the bare November trees, telling herself she was being practical, telling herself she was protecting herself, telling herself this was the decision of a woman with self-respect. She had been protecting herself from a sentence that had never had her name on it. "Charlotte," Lucas's voice from the table. She turned. I was watching her with something she'd never expected to see on his face in this life. Not pity, which she would have resented, but the specific uncomfortable expression of a man who understands he is in the presence of a grief he helped cause by omission. "I should have said something that night. I saw your coat. I knew. I made a calculation." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, a rare thing, almost like self-recrimination. "I made the wrong one." "Why are you telling me now?" "Because he's coming apart." Simple. Direct. The voice of a man who has weighed something and reached a verdict. "And you deserve to know the truth regardless of what you do with it." She looked at him for a long moment. The shaking in her hands had not stopped. She pressed them harder against the table's edge. "He doesn't know," she said. Not a question. "He doesn't know what you heard. He doesn't know about Claire Donovan being the subject. He only knows that you left. And the letter. And the letter. Which he's read, Lucas said, and which he's responded to by canceling his schedule and sitting in a house with the porch light on. She closed her eyes. The porch light. Even now. Even without understanding why she'd left, without knowing what had broken the thing between them, he'd left it on. As if she might still come back. As if the gesture still meant what it had always meant, regardless of whether there was anyone left to mean it for. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "I need you to go," she said. Her voice was steady, barely. Lucas stood. He reached into his jacket, a careful, deliberate movement, nothing sudden, the movement of a man conscious of his reputation in enclosed spaces, and set a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. His schedule, the next 72 hours. "I thought you might want to know where he is and where he isn't." He buttoned his jacket. "What you do is your business, Charlotte. I'm not here to make that decision for you." He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, back to her. "For what it's worth," he said. He didn't finish the sentence immediately. Then, "In 11 years. Only you." He left. She listened to the crunch of his tires on the gravel, the engine, the slow, careful departure. And then there was nothing but the wind in the trees and the distant gray shimmer of the lake and the folded piece of paper on the table that she wasn't ready to touch yet. She sat back down. She sat for a long time, and the afternoon light moved through the window and the fire in the other room burned down to embers. And she sat with the specific weight of realizing that the worst thing you can do to yourself is confirm a fear you invented. She had taken apart her own life. She had packed a bag and written a letter and driven 2 hours and 40 minutes away from the man she loved because she had heard one sentence in a hallway and had not walked through a door and asked a single question. She was a precise woman. She prided herself on it. She stripped emotion from problems and looked at structures. She made lists. She was methodical. She had heard half of a conversation and had not, in 3 weeks, once considered that she might be wrong. She looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking, finally. They were just her hands, familiar, capable, currently folded on a kitchen table in a borrowed cabin, while her whole life waited at the other end of a 2-hour highway for her to decide what to do with it. She reached for the piece of paper Lucas had left. She unfolded it, read it. It was exactly what he'd said, Vincent's schedule. The next 72 hours, written in Lucas's precise, minimal hand. No address for the estate. He hadn't included that, which was its own kind of statement, the assumption that she already knew how to find her way home. She set the paper down. Outside, the light was fading. The lake had gone from gray to a dark and unreadable pewter, the trees at its edge mere shapes against the dimming sky. In an hour, it would be full dark out here, the particular total darkness of a place without city light, the kind of dark that makes you aware of exactly how much of what you thought you could see was just ambient glow borrowed from other people's lives. She thought about Vincent in the estate with the porch light on. She thought about herself here, in the dark, with a piece of paper and the ruins of a misunderstanding large enough to reshape both their lives. She thought about what it meant, not the misunderstanding itself, which was almost beside the point now, but the shape of it. The reason she had heard one sentence and had not asked the question. The reason she had spent 3 years loving a man with her whole self and had still, in the first moment of real uncertainty, believed without hesitation that she was expendable, that the fine print had always been there, that she had always been the kind of person who could be replaced. She hadn't been afraid of Vincent. She had been afraid of herself, of the version of herself that believed she wasn't worth keeping. And she had run from a man who left the porch light on to protect herself from a sentence he'd never said. She stood up. She did not feel better exactly. The clarity she'd just arrived at was not the comfortable kind. It had edges, and it implicated her in ways she was going to have to sit with for a long time. But it was real, which was more than the story she'd told herself for 3 weeks had been. And she had always, even at cost, preferred real to manageable. She went to the window one more time. The lake was almost invisible now, just the faintest shimmer where the last of the sky's light was catching the water. She stood there and looked at it and made the second clear decision she'd made since this started. She was not going back tonight. Not like this. Frantic, overwhelmed, careening back into his arms because the reason she'd left had just been removed. That was not how she wanted to do this. She owed them both more than that. She would go back. but she would go back as herself. Not as relief, not as a correction, not as a woman who had just been told she was wrong and was rushing to apologize for the inconvenience of her own feelings. She would go back when she knew what she wanted to say. She went to find more firewood. The night came in fully, cold and starless under a thick cloud cover, and the cabin filled with the sound of the fire she rebuilt, and the distant sound of the lake, and her own breathing, and Charlotte Whitmore sat in the warmth she'd made herself and began, carefully and without rushing, to figure out what a woman said to a man she'd half destroyed with a silence she should never have kept, and what, if anything, came after the truth. She left the cabin at 6:40 in the morning, not because she'd decided in the night. She hadn't slept enough to decide anything in the night, but because she'd woken at 5:15 to the sound of the wind off the lake, hitting the north-facing windows with a sound like an open hand against wood, and she'd lain there in the dark and understood that another day of sitting with the fire and the paper and her own thoughts was going to hollow her out completely. She had been still long enough. Stillness had gotten her here. She packed what she'd unpacked, made the bed with the same mechanical care she always brought to borrowed spaces. You leave a place the way you found it. That was the rule, her mother's rule, one of the few that had actually served her. She washed her mug and the plate from last night's dinner and dried them and put them back exactly where they'd been. She wrote Dana a note, short, not explanatory, just, "Thank you. I'll call soon. See," and left it on the counter with the spare key. She sat in the rental car in the dark driveway for 3 minutes before she started it. She thought, I don't know what I'm going to say. She started the car. She drove south through the early morning, the roads empty and the sky still fully dark for the first hour, the trees on both sides of the highway bare and black against the slightly lighter black of the sky. The heat came up slowly in the car, and she drove without music, without podcasts, without anything that would give her mind something external to process, because what she needed to do right now was not consume, but metabolize. She needed to go through, not around. What Lucas had told her had not, in the night, become simpler. She'd hoped it might. Sometimes things that feel enormous at 5 in the afternoon look manageable by morning, the way fevers break, some natural diminishment. It hadn't. If anything, it had become more complex, the way a landscape reveals itself fully only when you've had time to look at all of it. The central fact was this. She had heard a sentence and she had not asked a question. She had not asked because she was afraid. And she was afraid because somewhere beneath the 3 years and the porch light and the forehead kisses and the croissants delivered to a desk, beneath all the specific and careful evidence of being loved by this particular man, there was still a version of Charlotte Whitmore who believed, in the deep, wordless, architectural way that childhood convictions survive everything, that she was not the kind of person someone kept. That was not Vincent's failure. That was hers. Or rather, it was the failure of every man who'd come before him, deposited into her like sediment, layered and compacted over years until it felt like bedrock, until it felt like simply knowing yourself. She'd let old damage interpret new evidence, and the interpretation had been catastrophic. And yet, and this was the part she'd been turning over since midnight, the feeling had been real, the fear had been real. The 3 weeks of watching herself disappear from their shared life had happened in her body, not just her mind, and the grief of it was not fictional just because its premise had been wrong. You could not simply subtract the cause and have the wound disappear. That wasn't how wounds worked. So she had something to account for too. Not just the misunderstanding, but the reason for it. The specific shape of her own fear. If they were going to be honest with each other, and she would not go back for anything less, she was certain of this. Then she was going to have to say out loud the things she had never said to him, the things she'd never said to anyone, which was, I did not fully believe I was safe here, and I don't know yet whether that was about you or about me, but I need to know, and I need you to be honest with me regardless of what the answer costs us. She could feel, even thinking it, how much that sentence was going to cost her. She drove. The sky started to lighten somewhere around the Connecticut-New York border, a reluctant gray November lightning, not the dramatic progression of a clear day, but the gradual realization that it was day rather than night, like the sky deciding it might as well. She crossed into Westchester and the traffic started to thicken, the first commuters, the city asserting itself. She checked the time, 7:52. According to Lucas's schedule, Vincent had a 9 a.m. call with the foundation's legal team, Something about the Donovan situation, the irony of which was not lost on her. And after that, the day was listed as open, which in Vincent's vocabulary meant he'd be at the estate. Working, probably. Or whatever he'd been doing for the past 4 days that Lucas had described, with characteristic understatement, as not himself. She took the exit for the estate. She had not called. She'd thought about it, had picked up her phone twice in the cabin and set it back down, and had decided against it both times. Not out of cruelty, but out of a clear understanding of her own limits. She could not say any of what needed to be said through a phone. She needed the room and the actual air between them and the ability to watch his face and let him watch hers. Everything that mattered between two people happened in the space between them, not across a signal sent between satellites. She would either find him there or she wouldn't. She pulled into the long driveway at 8:23 and sat in the idling car for a moment, looking at the house. The porch light was on. It was 8:20 in the morning, full gray daylight, and the porch light was burning on its fixture beside the front door, which meant it had been on all night and no one had turned it off, which meant either no one had thought to or it had been left on deliberately, and she knew. She knew in the part of her that had learned to read him the way you learn a language you end up dreaming in, that it had not been an accident. She turned off the car. She sat for one more moment, hands in her lap, looking at that light, and something cracked open in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but occupied the exact territory between them where the most honest feelings live. Then she got out of the car. The front door was unlocked. This was not unusual. The estate had a security system comprehensive enough that the lock on the front door was essentially symbolic during daytime. But she stood on the front step for a moment with her hand on the handle before she turned it, not because she was afraid to go in, but because she wanted to acknowledge the threshold, the before and after of it. She had walked out of this door 4 days ago with a suitcase and a decision. She was walking back in with neither. She went in. The hallway was dim, the overhead lights off, the morning gray coming in through the side lights. She set her bag down by the door, quietly, out of habit, the habit of a woman who had learned the acoustics of this house over 3 years and knew exactly how sound traveled through it. She stood still and listened. From the direction of the study, she heard nothing. From the kitchen, the distant, specific sound of a coffee machine. She went toward the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with his back to her. He was not in a suit. This was the first thing she registered. Vincent Callahan, on a Thursday morning with a 9 o'clock call, was not in a suit. He was in the dark trousers and the gray shirt he sometimes wore in the evening when he'd come home and changed, the shirt open at the collar, and he was standing at the counter with both hands braced on the edge and his head bent forward, not pouring coffee, not doing anything, just standing there in the posture of a man who has been running on fumes long enough that standing still requires more effort than it should. He had not heard her come in, or he had and was not ready to turn around yet. With Vincent, it was impossible to always be certain which. She said, "You left the light on." He turned, and she saw she was not prepared for it, had thought she was and was not. She saw what 4 days had done to him. He was not destroyed. He would not ever look destroyed. She understood that about him. It was structural, some fundamental quality of him that would not permit complete collapse. But there were shadows under his eyes that were not from one bad night, and the line of his jaw was tight with the particular tension of a man who had been clenching it for days. And his eyes, when they found her, had a quality she had only seen in them twice before, a rawness he almost never allowed. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She looked back. "Charlotte," he said finally. And that was it. Just her name, just that. And in the single word she could hear the entire 4 days, the unslept nights, the porch light burning in the empty morning, the letter he had read 100 times according to Lucas, and not once understood. "I know," she said. "I have things I need to say. Can you let me say them?" His jaw moved. He nodded. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat 6 weeks ago learning that she was losing this life piece by piece, and sat down, and he came and sat across from her without her having to ask. And for a moment they just looked at each other across the table in the gray morning light, with the coffee machine still doing its small, irrelevant work behind him. "I heard you," she said, 3 weeks ago. "The night I came home in the rain. I came in through the side and I heard you talking to Lucas in the study." His expression shifted. Not dramatically. Vincent did not do dramatic expression shifts. But something moved through it, a kind of recalibration. I heard you say, she kept her voice level. This was not the time to break apart. I heard, if she ever fails me, I'll replace her. I heard that one sentence. I didn't hear anything else. I walked away and I stood in our room with my coat still on, and I decided it was about me. He was very still. I never asked you, she said. I heard one sentence in one hallway, and I spent 3 weeks building a case against you without once giving you the chance to testify. She paused, held his gaze. Lucas came to the cabin yesterday. He told me about Claire Donovan. Something crossed his face at that, sharp, complicated, the look of a man processing several things at once. And she watched the understanding arrive in him, watched him trace it backward, the conversation and the timing and the wet coat she'd left in the hallway, and 3 weeks of her slow, silent departure making sudden, terrible sense. He closed his eyes. 1 breath. 2. He opened them. Charlotte. His voice was different now, lower and rougher, like something that had been held under pressure had been released. It was never, not once, not for a single He stopped. Started again. You have never been something I would replace. You are not a thing I could replace. There is no version of... He stopped again, and she recognized it now, recognized the thing she was watching. Vincent Callahan reaching the edge of his own articulateness, which almost never happened, which happened only when the thing he was trying to say was too important to trust to the first words that arrived. I know, she said. Then why? Because I heard it and I believed it. She kept her voice even. Not because of anything you did, because I was ready to believe it. Because somewhere in me there has always been this waiting. For the moment when someone I love decides I'm not worth the maintenance. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I have been carrying that my whole life, and I brought it in here with me, and I set it down somewhere in this house, and I forgot about it, and then I heard one sentence in a hallway, and it found me again. He looked at her. That's not about you, she said. What I did, leaving, the letter, 3 weeks of silence, the fact of it is about me, about what I was afraid of. But the part where I didn't ask you, her voice cracked, barely, just a hairline fracture she steadied immediately. The part where I didn't walk through that door and say, Vincent, what does that mean? Is it about me? That part I owe you an accounting for, because you deserved the question. You deserved the chance to answer. The kitchen was very quiet. Vincent had his hands flat on the table now too, mirroring her without being conscious of it. And he was looking at her with an intensity that was not anger and not relief, and not anything simple. It was the look of a man who is processing something at several levels simultaneously, and has enough discipline not to let any of them leak into the others prematurely. Why didn't you ask me? He said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of someone who needed the actual answer. Because I was afraid the answer would confirm it. He didn't look away. I was afraid, she said, that if I asked and the answer was yes, that it was about me, that there were conditions, that I'd been wrong about the whole thing, I would not survive it. And not knowing felt like something I could live inside of, wrong, but survivable. And leaving? Was me deciding that I would rather lose it on my own terms than wait to be lost. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. The specific work of a man receiving something that is both painful and clarifying, both accusation and confession, and refusing to flinch from either quality. I failed you, he said. She shook her head. I did. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before, a kind of stripped-down directness without any of the usual structure around it. Not the conversation. I couldn't have known you'd hear it, and the content was what it was, about a woman who had nothing to do with you. But you have been in this house for 3 years, and you went 3 weeks believing I might discard you, and I didn't see it. I noticed something was wrong. I asked twice. I accepted the answers you gave me. He paused. I should not have accepted them. You were telling me something was wrong by the fact of the answers you were giving me, and I read it as needing space, and I gave you space, and I needed you to push, she said quietly. Yes. But I also needed to not be the kind of person who falls apart over a half-heard sentence. We both needed things we didn't get. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact, the way he stated most facts. The question is what we do now. She looked at him across the table. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. I know that I love you. I know that I came back here because Lucas told me the truth, and because whatever I was running toward in Connecticut, I don't think it was actually a life I wanted. I know that I'm angry. At me? At myself, for being afraid, for not asking, for 3 years of loving you completely and still, at the first real test, choosing fear over you. She looked at her hands. I'm angry that I did that. And I'm angry that part of the reason I was able to do it so easily is because I'd never told you. Never told you about the fear, about where it came from. I kept that whole part of myself in a room you didn't know existed, and then I acted surprised when you couldn't respond to something you didn't know was happening. The coffee machine made its final sound and went quiet. Neither of them moved toward it. Vincent said, I need you to tell me. Now? When you're ready. He held her gaze. All of it. The fear and where it started and why you could listen to one sentence in a hallway and believe it was about you. I want to understand that. Not to fix it. He caught himself, and she almost smiled because fixing things was so deeply his instinct that the effort to override it was visible. Not to fix it, to understand it. That's going to take more than a morning. I know. And it's going to require... She stopped, looked at him directly. It's going to require you to be honest with me about things I haven't asked about yet. About how you see us. About what this is. About whether the life we've been living here is the one you actually want or the one you've constructed and I've filled a role in. His jaw tightened. You have never been a role. I know that now. But I need to hear you say it. I need to hear things said out loud that we have both been... We've been so quiet, Vincent. We've been so careful and so quiet with each other, and I didn't know how much danger that was until it was already the reason everything went wrong. She met his eyes. I need words. I need actual sentences. Not the porch light, not the flowers, not the croissants. Those matter. Those are real. I'm not diminishing them. But they can't be the whole language. I need the actual words. He sat with that. She waited. Vincent Callahan was not a man who spoke quickly when something mattered. She had learned this early and had come to understand it as a form of respect, the refusal to produce language faster than it could be true. She waited and watched him and felt the kitchen around them in a way she hadn't felt a room in weeks, fully, present, without the dulling film of performed normalcy. I love you, he said. I have been, since before I understood that I was. Since that first meeting when you told me exactly why you'd redirected the Downtown Arts Center funding and looked at me like you expected me to disagree and were completely prepared to defend it. Something moved in his eyes. Not sentiment, but the very specific look of someone locating a precise and important memory. I understood, sitting across from you at that table, that you were going to be a problem for me. She felt her throat tighten. Not because you were difficult, because you were real. You were the most real person I'd been in a room with in years, and I didn't know what to do with that. He paused. I still don't, sometimes. But I know that this house without you in it is not something I will accept as permanent. I know that the ring on your hand or not on it does not change that. I know. He stopped. I know I should have said more. All of it. All the time. You're right that we've been quiet. I made us quiet. I am not good with words as a primary mode. I know. But that's not an excuse, it's a reason I should have been working harder to overcome, because you needed the words and I was giving you... He made a brief gesture, frustrated. Light bulbs. She almost laughed. Almost. You're not wrong, he said, about needing them, or about what I owe you in terms of honesty. Ask me anything, right now or any time. I'll answer. He held her gaze with an unwavering directness she had always found both frightening and safe. There is nothing about how I see you or what this is that should ever have been unclear enough that one sentence in a hallway could undo it. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Her voice was quieter now. Then I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly, regardless of what you think the answer will cost you. Ask. If I had failed you, actually failed you, not Claire Donovan, but me, in some real and significant way, what would you have done? The question sat in the air between them. He didn't look away from it. That depends on what you mean by failed, he said slowly. I don't mean anything specific. I mean, in your mind, in the actual architecture of how you think about this, is there a version of me failing you that ends this? Is there a condition? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing what he always did with important things, taking it apart, examining it, refusing to answer until he could answer truly. If you chose to leave, he said, that would end it. Not because I'd want it to, but because I won't hold someone. If you chose someone else. If you deliberately... He stopped. There are things that are choices and things that are failures, and they're not the same. A choice to go is different from a stumble. I don't... His jaw worked. Charlotte, I have not spent 3 years building a life with you so that I could discard it the first time something was hard. That's not what I was saying to Lucas. That's not what I've ever... I know, she said again. I need you to not just know it, he said, and his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with that current under it she'd heard only twice before. I need you to have actually heard it. I'm hearing it. Are you staying? This question was direct and unornamented. No framing, no softening. Just the real question, the only one that mattered, asked the way he asked everything that mattered. Without protective distance, fully exposed to the answer. She looked at him. And here was the thing she'd worked out in the cabin, in the long night by the fire. She was not going to say yes out of relief. She was not going to say yes because the premise of her leaving had been wrong, because that would make her return simply the correction of an error. And it was not that, or it was not only that. She was going to say yes, or she was going to say she wasn't ready, and both would be the truth. And she was only going back to a version of this life that was built on truth, because she had seen what the other version looked like. And it looked like 3 weeks of sleeping badly and performing normalcy and a letter on a desk. I want to stay, she said. That's not the question anymore. The question is whether we can build something that doesn't depend on me trusting your gestures and you trusting my silence, because neither of those is enough. No, he said, they're not. We need to be the kind of people who ask questions. Yes. And say things out loud even when... She stopped, felt the next part wanting to arrive, let it, even when they're the things that show the soft parts, the afraid parts. He looked at her, and she could see it cost him something to hold that look steady. Not the holding itself, he had extraordinary discipline, but what the look required him to acknowledge. He was not a man who displayed soft parts. She was not a woman who named afraid parts. They were, in this specific way, almost identically constituted, which was perhaps why they had been so perfectly set up to fail each other in this exact fashion. Okay, he said. Quiet. Final, in the way his okays were always final. I want coffee, she said. Something moved through his face, something she could only call the Vincent Callahan equivalent of relief, the barely visible relaxation of a specific sustained tension. And he got up and went to the machine and got 2 cups and brought them back and set hers in front of her with 1 sugar, which she had never once had to ask for in 3 years. And she wrapped her hands around it, and the heat moved into her palms. He sat back down. They drank their coffee. Outside, the November morning was doing its gray and unhurried business. A car passed on the road beyond the property. The radiator clicked once and went quiet. The light on the porch was still burning, finally visible now as something faint and warm against the daylight. Vincent, she said. He looked up. I need to tell you something about where the fear started. She set down her cup, kept her hands around it. It's not about you. It predates you by a long time, but you deserve to know it because it almost cost us everything. And she felt the breath go through her, unsteady, the body's honest response to being about to say something it has never said. And because the only way I know to make sure it doesn't cost us anything again is to bring it out of the dark and show it to you. He put his cup down. He sat forward, elbows on the table, and gave her his complete attention. The real kind, the full measure kind, the look she had fallen in love with at a conference table when she was explaining foundation funding decisions and had somehow felt, for the first time in her life, that someone was actually listening to all of it, not just waiting for the part they wanted to respond to. Tell me, he said. She began. She told him about her mother, about the particular education of watching someone love men who always had an exit clause written into their affection, who were generous until they weren't, devoted until something better came along, present until the day they simply stopped being present. She told him about the age she'd been when she'd understood this pattern. 11, sitting at the kitchen table watching her mother get off the phone with a face that said the fine print had been invoked again. and the private, definitive decision she'd made. She would not be that. She would be too useful, too capable, too precisely indispensable to discard. She would make herself a person worth keeping. She told him how that had worked, and how it had failed, and how the failure had looked. The relationships that had lasted precisely as long as she was performing correctly and had ended the moment she allowed herself to be tired or uncertain or wrong. The men who had confirmed, one after another, the conclusion she'd reached at 11. The way she'd taken each confirmation and incorporated it, building the wall with better and better materials. She told him that the day she'd walked into his office with the foundation portfolio under her arm, she had been the most defended version of herself she had ever been. Efficient, professional, precisely armored. She told him that he had undone that armor so slowly and so specifically that she hadn't noticed it happening until she was already without it. And she told him that the night in the hallway, the thing that had broken her wasn't really the sentence. It was the sudden, vertiginous awareness that she had let herself become undefended with someone who might still be capable of leaving, and that the sentence had felt like proof that her mother's education had been right all along, that there was always an exit clause, that she had simply been the last to find it. She talked for a long time. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer corrections or counter-arguments, or the practical, solution-oriented responses that were his instinct. He sat and he listened, and he let her get through the whole of it, and when she finally stopped and picked up her coffee, which was cold now, and wrapped her hands around it anyway, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother's men failed her." "Yes. They failed you too, before you were old enough to have protected yourself from it." "Yes. And then you spent the next 20 years proving to yourself that you didn't need protection." She looked at him. "And then," he said, and his voice was very quiet now, stripped to something she rarely heard in it, "you found someone you decided to trust with the part you'd been protecting. And the first time something looked like a threat to that, every piece of that 20-year-old education came back." "Yes," she said. "That's not a flaw," he said. "That's what it looks like when someone has survived something. Survival leaves marks. I know something about that." She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. "I'm not without my own architecture, my own reasons for being quiet, for expressing things in gestures rather than words. I was not taught that feelings were something you said out loud. I was taught that feelings were something you handled, and if you handled them correctly, no one needed to know you'd had them." He paused. "That served me well in a great many contexts. It did not serve you." "Or you," she said. "Or me." "Correct." She felt something shift in the room. Not a resolution, because nothing this complex resolved cleanly, but a realignment. The two of them sitting across a kitchen table with their cold coffee and their combined decades of self-protective behavior and the specific, rare honesty of people who have scared themselves enough to stop pretending the pretending is fine. "I'm not the same woman I was before the hallway," she said. "I need you to know that. I can't promise I'll never be afraid again. I can't promise the old voice won't come back. I'm going to need you to—" She searched for the right phrasing. "I'm going to need you to keep talking, even when it's easier not to, even when talking feels like giving something away." "I know," he said, "and I need—" She stopped. "I need you to tell me if something changes. If there's ever a real concern. About us. About me. About anything that would— I need to hear it from you first. Not from a hallway." "You will." No hesitation. "Always." She looked at him. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not the kind that would look like anything in a film. Just his hand on hers, warm and steady and absolutely present. And she felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of something that has been earned rather than given. She turned her hand over. She held his. They sat like that for a while, two careful people at a kitchen table in the November morning, with the porch light still burning outside and the cold coffee between them, and 3 weeks of damage and 40 years of accumulated self-protection sitting in the room with them like weather, like something the house would need to air out slowly over time. She thought, this is where it starts, not where it ends. She thought, this is the first real thing we've said to each other, and we've been together for 3 years. She thought, we have a very long way to go, and we are going to have to be completely different kinds of people to get there. And I think we might both be willing. Outside, the morning turned over into mid-morning, and the light changed fractionally, and the porch light finally caught someone's attention. She heard Vincent say something low, and then the sound of him briefly getting up, and then the specific small click of a switch, and the light went off. Not because it wasn't needed anymore, because it was finally day. She looked at the window where the morning was coming in, gray and honest, the November light with no warmth in it and no pretense of warmth, just the actual light of the actual day, and she thought that this was, in its way, exactly what she'd come back for. Not the porch light, the day. The real light that didn't require someone to turn it on, the kind that came regardless, that neither of them had to maintain, that simply existed because that was what light did. It returned, reliably, even after the longest night, and if you were still there when it came, you had the choice of stepping into it or staying where the dark was familiar. She was still there. She was stepping into it. "I should eat something," she said. "Yes." He was already up, moving toward the refrigerator with the specific purposefulness of a man who had been given something practical to do and was grateful for it. "Margaret left things. There's Vincent." He turned. She looked at him across the kitchen. This man she'd almost lost by not speaking. This man she'd almost lost herself by not asking. This man who kept the porch light on and said her name like it was simply the correct word for something he was always thinking about. And she said, "Thank you for not turning the light off." He looked at her. "I mean before," she said. "When I was gone. You left it on." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know how long you'd be," he said simply. She nodded, pressed her lips together, held it together, barely, and then let it go and breathed. "Make me something with eggs," she said. "I haven't eaten properly in 4 days." And he turned back to the refrigerator, and the kitchen filled with the small, ordinary sounds of a man making breakfast. And she sat at the table with both hands around a cold mug and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was not yet peace, but was the ground beneath it. The solid, unromantic, absolutely necessary ground upon which the actual work of two people could begin. He made scrambled eggs. This was, Charlotte would later think, exactly right. Not an omelet, which required a particular kind of confidence and presentation. Not something elaborate that would have turned breakfast into a statement. Just eggs, scrambled in the pan with the focused attention he brought to everything, and toast from the bread Margaret kept in the second drawer, and sliced tomatoes because there were tomatoes on the counter and they were going to go bad otherwise. Practical. Unornamented. Completely him. He put the plate in front of her and sat down with his own, and they ate without speaking for a while. And the silence this time was different from every silence they'd shared in the past 3 weeks. Not the silence of things unspoken, but the silence of two people who have just said a great deal and need a moment to let it settle into their bodies. The way rain settles into dry ground, taking time, finding depth. She ate everything on the plate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her, and then it became suddenly and urgently apparent that 4 days of anxiety and minimal eating had left her with an almost physical need, and she ate with an unself-consciousness she'd normally have managed around him. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it, the specific, careful way Vincent Callahan did not say things that would make a person aware of being observed. She put her fork down. "The foundation," she said. He looked up. "I made some changes while I started transitioning some things to Priya, the spring cycle, some of the board relationships." She paused. "I need to go back and undo some of that." "Not necessarily." He said it without pressure, setting his own fork down. "What you described, giving Priya more authority, is something you've been considering for 2 years. She looked at him. "You mentioned it," he said. "Last March. You said she was ready, and you weren't sure what you were waiting for." "I remember. What you did for the wrong reasons might still be the right thing." She sat with that. "The foundation isn't going anywhere," he said. "Priya isn't a replacement. She's someone you built. You can redesign your role there without... This doesn't have to look like retreat." "I know." She looked at her plate. "I know that. I acted without thinking clearly. I made decisions from fear instead of strategy, and now I need to figure out what of it was actually sound and what of it was just escape architecture. Take the week. There's work that needs... Take the week," he said again, and it wasn't a command, it was the specific Vincent Callahan delivery of a thing he considered self-evident and was not going to repeat a third time. The foundation will function. Priya will handle it. And you need time that isn't crisis management. She looked at him. We need time, he said, correcting himself. That isn't crisis management. She nodded. He picked up his fork and finished his eggs, and she looked at the side of his face and thought about the 4 days he'd spent in this house alone and what that had looked like from the inside. She had a picture of it, impressionistic, probably not entirely accurate, assembled from Lucas's description of a man who wasn't himself and the single detail of the porch light burning in daylight because no one had turned it off. Vincent, she said. What did you think I meant? In the letter. She watched him. When you read it, not knowing what you know now. What did you think it was about? He set his fork down again. Considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought I'd done something, he said, or failed to do something. Something I was unaware of. He looked at the table. I read the letter 4 times that night, and I kept looking for the specific thing. You said you couldn't live with the uncertainty of being replaceable. You said you wouldn't wait to be discarded, and I couldn't find... His jaw tightened. I couldn't locate what I'd done that made you feel that way. I kept going back, looking for the place where I'd failed to be clear, and I couldn't find it. Because it wasn't in anything you did. I know that now. He paused. Then I thought I must have missed something obvious that I'd been blind to. It seemed impossible that you could have been carrying that for 3 years, and I'd had no idea. She looked at her hands. I was good at not showing it. You were. There was no accusation in it, just acknowledgement, the same way he'd receive a fact about weather. And I was good at not pushing, so we were well matched in the ways that didn't serve us. That's a very generous way to put it. It's accurate. He looked at her. I could have pushed harder. That Tuesday night, when you came to bed and you were somewhere else, I knew. I chose to interpret it charitably and give you space. I've spent 4 days wondering whether the charitable interpretation was actually just the convenient one. Whether I didn't push because I thought you needed space or because I didn't want to find out what was wrong. She looked at him. What do you think the answer is? He was quiet for a moment. Both, probably. He held her gaze steadily. I like knowing what I'm dealing with. It's easier to manage a problem I can see. And a part of me understood that what was happening with you was something I might not be able to manage, and that was uncomfortable. So I gave you space and called it respect. She had not expected that, the specific, unflattering honesty of it. Not a man confessing a small fault to seem humble, but a man who had actually looked at himself and reported what he found without improving the picture. That's very honest, she said. You asked for honesty. I did. That's what it looks like, he said. It's not flattering. No. She looked at him. But it's true. And that matters more right now. He held her gaze for a moment and then picked up both their plates and took them to the sink, and she listened to the water run and thought about what it meant to be with someone who, when asked to be honest, chose the version of honesty that cost him something rather than the version that redeemed him. It was not a small thing. She'd known people who were capable of the flattering confession, the self-criticism that was still, underneath, a performance. This was different. This was a man looking at a thing he'd done and naming it accurately without decorating it. She had fallen in love with him twice in this kitchen. Once a long time ago, a slow falling she hadn't named until it was complete. And now again, in this gray morning, over scrambled eggs and a sentence that didn't try to make him look good. She got up and brought her glass to the sink, and he was rinsing the pan, and she stood beside him and didn't say anything. And after a moment, she leaned her shoulder against his arm. Not a dramatic gesture, just the weight of her shoulder against his, small and deliberate. And she felt him go still for half a second before he adjusted his footing almost imperceptibly and pressed back. They stood like that for a moment at the sink. Then she went to get more coffee, and he went to get his reading glasses from the study, and the morning continued into itself, the first ordinary morning of the new thing they were making. The week stretched out in ways Charlotte hadn't anticipated. She had imagined, when she imagined it at all, which she'd been careful not to do too concretely, that coming back would feel like a particular kind of resolution, a before and after. A door closed behind her. In practice, it felt more like a climate than an event. Warm in some hours, raw in others, changing with a logic that wasn't always legible. There were mornings she woke up and felt the certainty of the decision clearly. felt the rightness of being here, in this room, next to this man. And those mornings were easy. She made coffee and read and worked on the careful process of reestablishing her professional footing in a way that was considered rather than reactive. And by evening, she could look at the day and find it solid. There were other mornings. One of them came 4 days after she returned. She woke at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark and felt the old fear arrive like a season. Not as a thought, not as a rational proposition she could argue with, but as a weather system, settling in before she was awake enough to close the windows against it. The sensation of being temporary, of being the kind of person who lasted right up until they became inconvenient. She lay with it for a while. Then she said, into the dark, "I'm having a bad hour." Vincent, who she had believed was asleep, said, "Tell me." And she did. Not a detailed excavation, not at 3 in the morning, not in the dark, but the essential fact of it, that the fear was back, that she knew it wasn't rational, that knowing it wasn't rational hadn't yet made it leave. He didn't try to argue it away. He didn't produce evidence against it. He just shifted and put his arm around her and said, "Okay, I've got you," in this voice he used when something was simply a fact he was presenting. And she lay there and felt his arm and the warmth and the specific steady pressure of him and waited for the weather to move through. It did. It took about an hour. And when it had moved through, she felt scraped out but cleaner, the way the air feels after a storm. And she said, "Thank you." And he said, "Go back to sleep." And she did. In the morning, he didn't mention it. Not because it hadn't happened, but because he had understood. She could tell that he had understood. That she didn't need it mentioned. She needed to know it was something she could say in the dark and have received. That was all. The receiving was the thing, not the discussion of the receiving. She thought, this is what I was trying to get to. Not the absence of fear, not the perfect understanding, the flawlessly articulate accounting of everything they'd been and done wrong and done right. Just this, a dark room and a bad hour and someone whose arm was there. Lucas Hale came to the house on the 6th day. Charlotte was in the sitting room when she heard the door, and she heard Vincent's voice in the hallway, and Lucas's, the low exchange of two men who had been in each other's professional orbit for 11 years and had developed a language of its own. Efficient, information-dense, with its own particular grammar. She sat with her book and listened to them move toward the study and the door close, and she thought about the last time she'd heard that particular progression of sounds and what it had made her do. She went back to her book. 40 minutes later, Vincent came into the sitting room alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the characteristic pause, the orienting to the space, and then came and sat across from her, and she set her book down. "The Donovan situation is resolved," he said. "What happened?" "She submitted her resignation this morning. Lucas negotiated the terms." He paused. "She'd been redirecting small amounts from the community grant line. Nothing that would have threatened the foundation's standing, but it was a pattern, and it was going to get worse. Lucas saw it coming in August." "You told him to let it run longer?" "I wanted the full picture before I acted. Rushing an accusation and getting it wrong would have cost more than waiting." She looked at him. "That's what you were talking about, that night." "Yes." She absorbed this. This was the final piece of the thing that had started in a hallway. Not a sentence about her. A business conversation about a woman who had been quietly stealing from an organization Charlotte had spent 3 years building. There was, in the complete picture of it, a bitter irony so precise it almost made her want to laugh. She had packed a bag and driven to Connecticut because Vincent Callahan had been protecting her foundation. "Charlotte," Vincent said. She looked up. "Lucas told me what he said to you, at the cabin." His voice was measured, but with something beneath it. Not quite anger, something adjacent to it. "That he knew the night of the rain and didn't say anything." "He told me." "That should have been me." He held her gaze. "That conversation, the one you overheard, I should have been the one to find you that night and tell you what it was about. Not Lucas, 11 days later, in a borrowed cabin. Me, that same night." He paused. "I didn't know you'd heard it, but if I had paid attention to what you looked like at dinner and followed that instead of giving you space, I might have. You couldn't have known. I could have known something was wrong. I did know something was wrong, I made the wrong call about what to do with that knowledge. He said it evenly, without drama, the same way he'd said it the morning she came back. The same unflattering accuracy. I want to say that clearly, not as self-punishment, just as... He stopped. As the thing I'm going to do differently. Because I understand now that giving you space when you're struggling is not the same as giving you support. And I made that mistake, and it compounded into something that cost us both a great deal. She looked at him. You're very hard on yourself, she said. I'm accurate about myself. Those aren't always the same thing. He considered that. Perhaps not. He held her gaze. But in this case, I think they are. I had information, not the full information, but enough. And I chose the option that was most comfortable for me and called it consideration. That's what happened. I'd rather call it by its right name than be absolved of something that didn't deserve absolution. She was quiet for a moment. Lucas, she said, how are you handling? He did the right thing, eventually. Vincent's voice was very dry. We've discussed the eventually. Harshly? Pointedly. A pause. He understands what he should have done. He understands why the delay was a problem. It's been addressed. Another pause, and something flickered in his expression. Not quite humor, but the ghost of it. He would like you to know, he said to tell you through me, that he is, his word, sorry. Spoken aloud, which I understand is not his natural mode, so you should know it cost him something. She thought about Lucas Hale at her kitchen table with his palms down and his careful eyes. She thought about the drive he'd made to a cabin in Connecticut on his own initiative, without instruction, because he'd made a calculation and it had been wrong and he'd gone to correct it. She thought about 11 years, and only you spoken in a voice that clearly didn't do that very often. Tell him I know, she said, and that it mattered, what he did. I'll tell him. She looked at him. You're not going to give me grief for saying that. Why would I? Because your consigliere went behind your back to find your fiancé. He went to tell someone the truth that should have already been told. I'm not going to fault him for the mechanism when the outcome was right. He paused. Besides, he told me what you said, at the cabin. What did I say? That you'd needed to be allowed to say it on your own terms, that you didn't want to be convinced, that he told you what you needed to know and then let you think. He looked at her steadily. He read you correctly. He's good at reading people. So are you. Not always. He said it without self-pity. Not with the people I'm closest to. I stopped reading them as carefully because I think I already know. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I'm going to be more careful about that. She held his gaze for a moment. We're going to have to keep doing this, she said. This, the actual talking. I need you to know that I'm not going to stop needing it just because the crisis is over. This is not a one-time repair. This is a practice, he said. Yes. I know. He held her gaze. I've been thinking about what you said, about the language of gestures versus words. You were right that I've used gestures as a substitute. They're not a substitute. They're supplemental, maybe, at best. He paused. I'm not going to become someone who is naturally verbose. I want to be honest about that. You're not going to get a man who talks about feelings at breakfast every morning. That's not the person I am. I'm not asking for that. Good. But I can do better than the porch light as primary communication. He said it with a very specific dryness that she recognized as him making a joke at his own expense, which he did rarely enough that she always caught it. I will do better than that. She felt the smile before she intended it. The porch light meant something. It's a light fixture. It should not have been carrying that much weight. She laughed. It came out before she could manage it, short and genuine, and she felt it move through her whole chest the way real laughter does. The involuntary kind, the kind the body produces without consulting the mind. And she saw his expression shift into that almost amused thing she had loved since the first time she'd seen it, the way his eyes went and the slight alteration at the corner of his mouth. It meant what it meant, she said, when she'd recovered. Yes. Quietly. It did. She called her mother on the 9th day. This was not something she'd planned. She'd been sitting in the small study she used as a workspace, looking at the spring grant cycle reports Priya had sent over, evidence of solid, capable leadership that Charlotte was beginning to accept as something to be glad of, rather than guilty about. and she'd looked out the window at the bare November garden and thought about the conversation she'd had with Vincent at the kitchen table, about the woman at the center of all of it, the mother who hadn't known she was providing an education. She picked up her phone. Her mother's name was Diane. She was 63 and lived in Atlanta and called twice a month on Sundays, calls that Charlotte managed with the precise warmth of someone who loved a person and had learned which subjects to avoid and which questions to not ask. They had a good relationship in the specific way of two people who had reached a careful equilibrium that neither of them particularly wanted to disturb. Charlotte was going to disturb it. The phone rang 4 times and then, "Charlotte? It's not Sunday." "I know. Is this a good time?" "I'm just doing the Hold on." The sound of a chair, a table, her mother settling. "There, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She paused. "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to know before I start that this isn't... I'm not angry. I'm not calling to..." She stopped. Started over. "I'm calling because I realized recently that I've been carrying something for about 30 years, and I never told you about it, and I need to now." A silence on the other end. "Mom," she said, "I learned when I was young from watching you. I learned that love always comes with an exit clause, that the people who love you will leave eventually, or replace you, or find a condition you didn't know you had to meet. And I've been running that belief through every relationship I've had since I was 11 years old, including the one with Vincent, and it almost destroyed us. And I need to tell you that because..." She felt the breath move through her, steadying. "Because I don't want to carry it without you knowing it's there. And because I don't want to blame you for something you never knew you were teaching." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then her mother said, very quietly, 11? "Somewhere around there." "I'm going to sit with that for a moment." A pause. "Charlotte, What happened? With the men? I know how it looked. I know what you saw." Her voice had something in it Charlotte hadn't heard before or hadn't been listening for. "I had my own version of exactly what you just described. My own 11-year-old who learned something she shouldn't have had to learn. I was living it out loud instead of carrying it quietly, which I suppose..." She stopped, "which did not make it less of a burden on you, just differently shaped." Charlotte sat in her study with the window and the gray garden and the phone pressed to her ear and felt something shift that had been in position for 30 years. Not a dramatic shift, not the ground moving, just an adjustment, the kind you feel in the joints when something that has been held wrong is finally held correctly. "I know," she said. "You should have been able to tell me." "I didn't know it was something to tell. It just felt like the truth." "Charlotte," her mother's voice was thick. "I'm sorry. I'm very sorry." She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. "I didn't call for an apology." "I know, but you're getting one." She sat with that. "Tell me about Vincent," her mother said after a moment. "Tell me what happened." And she did, in less detail than she'd told Vincent himself, but in more than she'd told anyone else. And her mother listened, really listened, the way Charlotte had never been entirely sure she was capable of, which made her understand that perhaps the equilibrium they'd maintained had protected them both from finding out what the other one could do. And when Charlotte was finished, Diane Whitmore said, "He left the light on." "Yes." "And when you came back, he made you eggs." "Scrambled." A pause. "I like him," her mother said. "I've always liked him. I liked him the first time you mentioned him, which was before you admitted you were in love with him, and I didn't say anything because I knew you'd tell me when you were ready." She paused again. "He's not like the ones I picked." "No," Charlotte said. "He's not." "Then I think," Diane said carefully, "that you should stop treating the lesson I accidentally taught you as if it applies to him, because it doesn't, and he's earned better than that." Charlotte looked at the window. "I know," she said. "You have to actually know it, sweetheart, not just understand it intellectually, in your body, in the 3 a.m. moments. I'm working on it. That's all any of us are doing." A breath. "Come to Atlanta, both of you. Before Christmas, if you can. I'd like to make dinner for the man who leaves the porch light on." Charlotte felt the thing in her chest again. That complex warmth that wasn't exactly happiness, but was related to it. That sense of things being in the right position after long displacement. "I'll talk to him." "Good." A pause. "Charlotte, I love you." I have always loved you without conditions. I did a very poor job of showing you what that looked like. I'm sorry for that." She closed her eyes. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She sat in the study for a while after the call ended, looking at the winter garden, and felt the sediment of 30 years stirring and slowly settling into a new configuration. Not gone. She was not naive enough to think that a phone call dissolved 30 years of accumulated learning, but named now, spoken to its source and acknowledged by its source. And something about the naming, the specific act of bringing it from the wordless interior into the open air where two people could look at it, had already changed its quality. It was no longer just hers. It was a shared history now, which meant it was something you could stand outside of, at least sometimes. Look at from a remove. She went downstairs. The ring was in the top drawer of Vincent's desk. She found this out not because he told her, but because she went into the study to return a book she'd borrowed from his shelf. A history of mid-century American architecture she'd been reading in pieces for weeks. And she opened the wrong drawer looking for a bookmark. And there it was. He hadn't put it away somewhere sealed, hadn't returned it or stored it properly. It was just there, in the top drawer, in the same position it had been placed when she'd set it on top of the letter, as if it had arrived in the drawer and hadn't been moved because there was no clear directive about what to do with it. She stood and looked at it. It was exactly as she remembered it, the modest band, the specific quality of it that she'd recognized immediately when she'd opened the box. The way it was exactly what she would have chosen for herself, which was, she understood now, because he had understood that about her without asking. He'd presented 3 options without preference. She'd chosen without hesitation. The choice had been hers. That had always been true. She'd just forgotten to account for it when she was building her case. She closed the drawer. She didn't say anything to him that evening, or the next morning. She let it sit where it was, in the drawer, in the back of her mind. And she thought about timing, not in a calculating way, not staging something, just in the way that you understand some things have their own right moment, and forcing them early ruins the quality of what they become. On the 11th day, Vincent came home from a meeting late in the afternoon, and she was in the kitchen, and he came in and put his coat over the chair. The familiar carelessness, the jacket and coat just living on things near wherever he ended up. And he stood at the counter for a moment and looked at her with that specific quality of attention, the one she had learned to read by temperature, and said, "How was your day?" The ordinary question. The question he had asked her 1,000 times in this kitchen. "Good," she said. And then, because she had promised herself, because they had both promised each other, she said the part that was harder. "I called Priya. We're going to redefine my role at the foundation. I'm going to stay involved with the major donors and the grant strategy, but she'll run the day-to-day operations. It's the right call, and I think I held on to full control longer than I should have, because I didn't trust that anything I'd built would hold without me." He was watching her. "That says something," she said, "about how I see myself, as someone who has to be essential or they'll be let go. I've been doing that here too, I think, making myself as useful as possible so there'd be no grounds to—" She stopped. "I see it now. I'm going to try to stop." "You are essential," he said, "not because of what you manage, because of who you are." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm starting to know it in the right place." He crossed the kitchen, stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. I was looking at her with the focused, unwasted attention that she had fallen in love with long before she'd admitted it, and his hands came up. The telegraphed movement, always, the half-second warning she'd been given since the beginning, and cupped her face, his thumbs at the line of her jaw. She felt the warmth of his hands and kept her eyes on his. "Charlotte Whitmore," he said. "Vincent." I should have said more. Much sooner. Much more often. His thumbs moved slightly. A small motion, unconscious probably, against her jaw. "I'm not going to spend time constructing the speech I should have given you a year into this, because that time has passed. But I want you to know—" He paused, the deliberate pause of a man choosing accuracy over speed. "I want you to know that there is no version of my life that I want that doesn't have you in it. Not because you manage anything or fill any role, because you are the most real person I have ever been in a room with. And I was afraid of that at first, and then I wasn't. And then I became so accustomed to you that I forgot to say so. I am saying so now. She felt her eyes sting. She kept her chin level. I'm not going to forget again, he said. I won't be perfect at this. You know that already. But I will not let it go unnamed for another year. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady, barely. The ring is in my desk. I know, I found it. I wasn't sure. He paused. I wasn't sure whether to say something about it or wait. You waited. I waited. He held her gaze. I don't know what you want to do about it. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I want you to know it's there because I put it there and I'm not moving on. That's not what the drawer means. I know what the drawer means. What does it mean? She looked at him. It means you didn't put it away, which means you were still holding the question open. Yes. She reached up and put her hands over his hands still cupping her face, her hands over his. I'm not ready today, she said. Not because I don't want it, because I want it from a different place than I did the first time. I want it because I'm sure, not because I'm afraid of losing it if I say no. I understand. Do you? You want to choose it, he said, not defer to it. Yes, I understand. She pressed his hand slightly. How much time do you need? That's not my question to answer. I know, I'm asking anyway. Something moved through his face. Take what you need. That's not patience, Charlotte. That's just, this is not something that ends. This is something that continues. Take the time. She looked at him for a long moment. My mother wants us to come to Atlanta, she said, before Christmas. He blinked. The shift of register, from the charged and serious to the suddenly specific and logistical, was slight enough that only she would have caught it. Atlanta. She wants to make dinner for you. She likes you. She's never met me. She knows about the porch light. She's decided. She felt the almost smile pulling at her. Fair warning, she'll ask you directly what your intentions are. She does that. She went 30 years deferring to men who had bad intentions, and she has a very low tolerance for ambiguity now. I'll tell her the truth, he said, without hesitation. Which is? He looked at her, steady, unwasted, completely there. That I intend to earn back what I let get damaged by not speaking clearly enough, and that I intend to keep earning it for as long as she'll let me. A pause. That's what I'll tell her. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. She dropped her hands. He dropped his. She turned back to what she'd been doing at the counter, the small, forgettable domestic task that had been happening before the conversation. And he went to hang up his coat, actually hang it this time, and the kitchen resumed its ordinary sounds around them. But the quality of the ordinary was different. It had been different since the morning she'd come back, and it would continue to be different, she understood. Not in a way that would always be obvious, not in a way that would announce itself every day, but different in the way that two people are different after they have said the things that needed saying and have decided, with full knowledge of what it costs, to continue anyway. That was not a small thing. She had lived long enough to know it was not a small thing. Most people never said the things that needed saying. Most people maintained the equilibrium and called it a relationship and got by. She and Vincent had broken the equilibrium, had had it broken for them, by a hallway and a rain and a sentence that had never been about her, and had walked through the breakage and come out the other side with something that was less comfortable and more real. Real things were heavier than comfortable things. She had decided she preferred the weight. On the 14th day, she went to his study to return another book. She opened the right drawer this time. Found what she was looking for. The bookmark she'd been using was a receipt she'd left in there weeks ago, before everything, in the ordinary way things get set down in shared spaces and forgotten. She found the receipt and was closing the drawer when she stopped. She looked at the ring. She picked it up. It was lighter than she remembered, or she'd simply gotten used to the weight of its absence on her hand. She held it between her thumb and index finger and looked at it in the study light. The clean, specific object she had chosen from 3 options without hesitation. The one she had set on top of a letter as a form of punctuation, as a way of saying, I understand the terms. She turned it. She thought about terms, about what she'd understood and what she'd understood wrong, about the difference between terms and conditions, between the ordinary requirements of a shared life and the exit clauses she'd always expected to find. There were no exit clauses here. She knew that now. Not as an intellectual conclusion, not as a thing someone had told her to believe, but as the knowledge that sits in the body, The 3 a.m. knowledge, the cold coffee at the kitchen table knowledge, the knowledge you earn by walking through the worst-case version of something and finding out what was actually on the other side. She slid the ring on, her hand, her finger, where it had been for 14 months before she took it off. It fit exactly as it had. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to find Vincent. I was in the sitting room with the afternoon papers, actual newspapers, physical ones, another thing she'd teased him about early and given up on changing. And he looked up when she came in and saw her face, and then his gaze went to her hand. He was very still. She sat down across from him. The same arrangement as 100 evenings in this room. The same gray afternoon light through the same windows. The same man across from her in the same chair, with the papers folded in his lap and his reading glasses on, and his complete unmediated attention on her face. "I'm not doing this because the situation is resolved," she said. "I'm doing it because I want to, because I'm choosing it from the right place." She held his gaze. "That's the distinction I needed to make." He set the papers down. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the side table with a care that betrayed the steadiness he was maintaining. "I know I said I needed time," she said, "and I did. 14 days was what I needed. I know that might seem... It doesn't seem like anything," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It seems like you." She looked at him. "You know when you know," he said. "That's how you've always been. You don't second-guess when the decision is right. You second-guessed for 3 weeks because the premise was wrong. When the premise is correct, you decide." He held her gaze. "So 14 days is right. If it took a day or a year, it would still be right." She breathed. "Come here," he said. She got up and crossed to his chair, and he stood and took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it, just held it, his thumb moving once across the band, an acknowledgement. Then he put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the sitting room with the gray afternoon coming through the windows and the newspapers on the floor where they'd slid, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the breadth of him, the warmth, the absolute steadiness of a man who had been waiting without requiring her to hurry. She thought about the 11-year-old girl at the kitchen table learning the wrong lesson. She thought, "I'm sorry it took this long to unlearn it. I'm sorry for what it cost us both." She thought, it was worth it. To come out the other side actually knowing. His hand moved to the back of her head. She felt his chest move as he breathed. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons do. Going thin and cold, the light coming sideways and silver through the bare trees, the particular beauty of a season that doesn't pretend to be anything warmer than it is. No warmth in it, no comfort. Just the actual light of the actual day, honest and sufficient. She could see it through the window over his shoulder. She let her eyes close. In 3 weeks, they would drive to Atlanta, and her mother would open the door and look at Vincent Callahan for the first time, and he would look back at her with that flat, direct gaze that most people found alarming. And Diane Whitmore, who had spent 63 years learning to read men who had bad intentions, would read him correctly in about 45 seconds and reach up and put her hand on his arm, and he would allow it, and Charlotte would stand in her mother's hallway and feel the last of the old weight shift and settle. In January, Charlotte would redesign her role at the foundation and find that what she'd feared would feel like diminishment was actually something closer to mastery, the ability to let a thing you've built live without you holding it constantly, to trust in what you've made. In February, on a Tuesday, Vincent's Day, as it turned out, the day she'd always been most herself, they would have the conversation about what the next chapter looked like, not in grand terms, but in the specific, logistical, completely unromantic way that real futures get decided, where and how and what they each needed the shape of it to contain. But that was all later. Right now there was the sitting room and the window and the gray November light and his hand at the back of her head and the ring on her finger and the whole long, specific, imperfect, absolutely real life of them continuing into itself. She kept her eyes closed. She breathed. She stayed.